It is 2 in the morning on October 31st, 2011. In a tower in Midtown Manhattan, a man is pacing. He has been awake for most of the last 48 hours. His shirt is untucked. His eyes are the eyes of a man whose numbers won't balance. His name is Jon Corzine, and he has run Goldman Sachs, the most powerful investment bank in the world. He has represented the state of New Jersey in the United States Senate. He has sat in the governor's mansion. He has been, by any reasonable measure, one of the most powerful men in every room he has ever entered. Tonight, he is waiting for a phone call he does not want to receive. When it comes, just before 2 in the morning, the voice on the other end tells him that hundreds of millions of dollars in customer funds, money that belongs to farmers in Minnesota, ranchers in Montana, grain cooperatives in Kansas, cannot be located. He does not shout. He does not hang up. People who were there that night describe a man who went very still. By dawn, the deal that was supposed to save everything has collapsed. By mid-morning, his firm has filed for bankruptcy. And $1.6 billion, real money belonging to real people, has vanished so completely that when Congress calls him to account for it 6 weeks later, the best answer the former head of Goldman Sachs can offer is this: "I simply do not know where the money is." This is the story of how Jon Corzine got to that room, and what it cost everyone else. John Stevens Corzine was born on New Year's Day, 1947, on a small family farm in central Illinois. His father grew corn and soybeans and sold insurance on the side. His mother taught school. It was not a wealthy family. It was a working one. You don't get from that farm to Goldman Sachs without a particular kind of hunger, the kind that doesn't really have a name until you've watched it operate for long enough. Corzine had it early. He was the kid who rescheduled breakfast meetings to 6:30 in the morning just to fit in one more conversation before the day started. He joined the Marines. He got an MBA. And in 1975, at 28 years old, he walked through the doors of Goldman Sachs. Goldman, in 1975, was a private partnership, lean, secretive, intensely hierarchical. The kind of place where you were expected to work yourself into the walls and wait your turn. Corzine did not wait his turn. By 33, he was a partner, a pace that even by Goldman standards was unusual. He made his name in the bond markets. Fixed income, the trading of government and corporate debt, was where the serious money moved in the 1980s. And Corzine understood it at an instinctive level that his colleagues found difficult to explain. One of them later put it this way: if it was a good trade for $100, he wanted to make it 1,000 or 1,000,000. That instinct made Goldman extraordinary amounts of money. It also created a pattern of behavior that the people around him noticed, but found difficult to confront, because the results kept justifying the approach. Corzine didn't just take positions. He took positions and then added to them. He didn't just make bets. He made bigger bets than anyone had authorized him to make. He looked to the outside world like the least threatening man in any room. Sweater-vested, bearded, soft-spoken, more avuncular professor than Wall Street titan. There was nothing about the exterior of Jon Corzine that said dangerous, which is perhaps why it took so long for anyone to treat him that way. By the mid-1990s, he had reached the top, senior partner, co-CEO of Goldman Sachs. And then, 1998 happened. That was the year Long-Term Capital Management, a hedge fund run by Nobel Prize-winning economists, nearly took the entire financial system down with it. LTCM had borrowed so heavily to finance its positions that when Russia defaulted on its debt and markets moved in ways the models said were impossible, the losses cascaded faster than anyone could contain them. The Federal Reserve stepped in to organize a private sector rescue. Goldman Sachs was part of it, and Corzine, as co-CEO, was at the table. He committed $300 million of Goldman's capital to the rescue. The problem was that he had only been authorized to commit $250 million. $50 million over the limit. Not a rounding error. A choice. A unilateral decision by a man who believed his read on the situation was better than the one his own institution had made. The rescue worked. The system held. Corzine was right. That was the problem. He had broken the rules, and the outcome had justified it. The lesson that experience should have taught him was about limits and the importance of the room's judgment alongside his own. The lesson it actually taught him was something else entirely. In January 1999, while Corzine was on a family skiing vacation in Telluride, his executive committee met. Hank Paulson, his co-CEO, his partner, led the conversation. By the time Corzine came off the mountain, it was over. What followed was grim. Corzine was frozen out of the firm he had built. He was reported to be working out of a car parked on the street outside Goldman's headquarters. Suit on, phone in hand, no longer able to get through the door. A man whose career had been defined by access, by proximity to power, by always being in the room, suddenly outside of it, literally. He resigned that January. Goldman went public that spring. Corzine's stake was worth approximately $400 million. He ran for the United States Senate. Think about that for a moment. Most men pushed out of the top job at Goldman take a board seat somewhere, start a family office. They do not spend tens of millions of their own dollars to run for public office in New Jersey. But the Senate told you something about Corzine that the money alone never could. It wasn't wealth he was chasing. It was standing. He needed, at some fundamental level, to be back in the room. To matter in a way that a brokerage account, however large, simply cannot make you matter. He won the Senate seat in 2000. He won the governorship in 2005. People who knew him well said he saw it as a stepping stone, that the path he imagined for himself ran all the way to the White House. What he didn't have was the ability to connect. Richard Cody, the former New Jersey governor, was asked about Corzine's political struggles. He said Corzine was earnest and numbers smart, but that New Jersey's politics operated on a different frequency, one that required warmth, instinct, the capacity to make an ordinary person feel seen. Corzine had spent his summers in the Hamptons. He couldn't get there. Corzine knew it. He once complained to Cody that people believed he had bought his Senate seat and his governor's seat. Cody's response was direct. Sorry, John. They're correct. You did. In 2007, he was nearly killed in a car crash on the Garden State Parkway. His approval ratings, already sliding, did not recover. In November 2009, he lost re-election to Chris Christie. He was 62 years old. He had run Goldman Sachs, served in the United States Senate, governed the state of New Jersey. He had more money than he could spend in several lifetimes. And he was not done. What happens to a man like that? A man whose identity is built entirely on being the most important person in the room. When the rooms stop calling, when the phone gets quieter, when the people who once needed him no longer do. Some men find peace in it. Some men find perspective. Jon Corzine went back to Wall Street, and he brought the hunger with him. Here is what MF Global actually was before Jon Corzine arrived. It was a futures commission merchant. That is the technical term. What it means in plain English is this: MF Global was a middleman. When a corn farmer in Minnesota wanted to lock in a selling price for his harvest 6 months before he actually harvested it, he called his broker. His broker called MF Global. MF Global went to the exchange and executed the trade on his behalf, holding his collateral, his deposit, his guarantee, in what was called a segregated account. Segregated meaning separate, meaning protected, meaning it belonged to the farmer, not to MF Global. And no matter what happened to MF Global, that money stayed with the farmer. That was the promise at the center of the futures markets. It had held for generations. It was considered by the people who used it and the people who regulated it, essentially inviolable. Jon Corzine understood this promise. He understood it completely. And he arrived at MF Global with a vision that had very little to do with it. He was going to build a trading firm, a real one, not a middleman, a market participant. He wanted MF Global to take positions, accumulate risk, make the kind of large directional bets that Goldman's trading desks had made when he ran that shop, and it was minting money. He started hiring. Around 1,000 new people came in from Wall Street, younger, hungrier, there because Corzine's name still meant something in that world. He started firing. Around 1,400 of the old guard went. These were people who had spent careers learning the specific, unglamorous business of commodities brokerage, who understood the rhythms of harvest seasons and the needs of the farmers and cooperatives on the other end of the phone. They left, and the institutional memory of what MF Global had been went with them. What remained was a trading floor that looked like Goldman Sachs and ran on a business model that was not built to support one. And Corzine started trading. The position he built was in European sovereign debt, government bonds, the IOUs that countries issue when they need to borrow money. By 2010, several European governments were in serious trouble. Greece was in crisis. Portugal and Ireland were under pressure. Italy and Spain were seeing their borrowing costs rise to alarming levels. The market was frightened, and when markets are frightened, prices fall. Corzine looked at those falling prices and saw value. His thesis was straightforward. Europe would not let these countries default. The European Central Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the Germans, they would step in, stabilize things, and when they did, those depressed bond prices would recover. Anyone who had bought them cheap would make serious money. It was a macro bet. The kind where you see something the market hasn't priced correctly, take the position before everyone else figures it out, and wait. Jon Corzine had spent his career making trades like this. He had been right many times. The mechanism he used requires one sentence of explanation, because it matters. Corzine used something called repo to maturity. In simple terms, MF Global borrowed money short-term, used it to buy European government bonds, and structured the deals so that the bonds were recorded as sold rather than held, which meant the exposure didn't appear on the balance sheet the way a conventional trade would. The risk was real. The scale was real. But it was structured to avoid immediate scrutiny. Someone reading the books quickly would not see the full weight of what was sitting there. By 2011, MF Global had built a position in European sovereign debt worth approximately $6.3 billion. The firm's entire equity, everything it was worth, was roughly $1.2 billion. He had made a bet more than 5 times the size of the entire company. If the position moved against him by just 20%, it would wipe out everything. There was no cushion, no room. The structure required the thesis to be right, and it required the market to cooperate before the short-term lenders who funded it lost their nerve. Pause on that. In 1998, Jon Corzine had overstepped his authorization at Goldman Sachs by $50 million. That was the fingerprint. This was the same hand, pressing down 13 years later, at a scale that dwarfed the entire firm he was supposed to be protecting. The scale had changed. The instinct had not. There were people inside MF Global who were uncomfortable with this. One account describes a senior figure at the firm who had grown uneasy about the fact that so much of the company's strategy had collapsed into a single bet by a single man. When this concern was raised, Corzine's response was not hostile. He was not a screamer. He was not the kind of executive who punished dissent with visible fury. He simply proceeded. The position kept growing. A Wall Street Journal account from that period captured it precisely. There was, at MF Global, no one else helping Corzine think through what to do on the European trade. It wasn't a strategy built by a team, stress-tested by a risk committee, pressure-checked by people with authority to push back. It was one man's conviction, scaled to the edge of what the firm could structurally bear. This is not unusual in finance. Some of the greatest trades in history have been made by individuals who saw what consensus missed and held the position long enough to be proven right. The problem is that the same psychology produces both outcomes. Conviction is not selective. It does not distinguish between being right and being wrong. It only knows how to hold on. For most of 2010 and into 2011, the position looked like it might work. European policymakers were talking. The ECB was signaling support. Corzine's thesis that the continent would hold together was not unreasonable. Serious analysts held similar views. But the market stayed frightened for longer than anyone expected, and MF Global had borrowed heavily to fund the position. Borrowing that needed to be rolled over every few weeks. As long as confidence held, the lenders said yes. In August 2011, Moody's downgraded MF Global's credit rating. In October, they downgraded it again. The short-term lenders got harder. The stock fell. The walls began closing. And here is the cruelest thing about the position Corzine had built. The European bonds he owned were not obviously wrong. Italy and Spain did not default. Europe did not collapse. Some analysts later estimated the positions would have been profitable had the firm survived another year. Jon Corzine was, in a narrow technical sense, probably right about Europe. He was just right in a way that arrived too late to save anything. And he had used money that was not his to make the bet. That is the sentence the whole story turns on. Not that he was wrong, that he was right at the wrong time, with the wrong capital, in a structure that could not survive the wait. By October 2011, MF Global was running out of time to find out. Friday, October 28, 2011, 4:15 in the afternoon. The markets closed with MF Global's stock down sharply on the week. The firm was still standing. Still, technically, functioning. What happened inside MF Global's offices that afternoon was a transaction that would later become the most scrutinized email chain in the collapse. A wire transfer of $175 million was sent from MF Global's New York accounts to cover an overdraft in its London office. The transfer was authorized. The question that would haunt the next 3 years of investigation, the question that may never be definitively answered, was exactly which account the money came from. MF Global's treasurer, Edith O'Brien, sent an email that afternoon documenting the transfer. Her words were 5. The wire was sent per JC's direct instructions. JC, Jon Corzine. A second email, sent the same afternoon at 2:20, described the source of the funds as a house wire, meaning it came from MF Global's own money, not customer accounts. That email went directly to Corzine and 2 of his aides. 2 emails, 1 authorization, 1 source designation, and between them, the central ambiguity that would define everything that followed. Corzine's defenders would say the house wire email proved customer funds were never touched. His accusers would say O'Brien's 5 words proved he knew exactly what he was doing. Neither side could fully prove the other wrong. That unresolvable gap between what was ordered and what was understood is why no criminal charge was ever filed. And it is why $175 million became the first crack in a dam holding $1.6 billion of other people's money. Corzine would later say he was told the funds were properly transferred, that he had no reason to believe customer money had been touched. He would say a great many things, most of them beginning with the words, "I do not." But that was 6 weeks away. On Friday afternoon, October 28th, Jon Corzine was focused on something else entirely. He was trying to save the firm. The weekend of October 29th and 30th, a negotiation in the dark. Corzine and his team had found what they believed was a buyer. Interactive Brokers, a sophisticated electronic trading firm. The deal was not signed. It was not certain. But there was a handshake, A framework, a set of numbers being worked through by lawyers on both sides. If the deal closed, MF Global would survive in some form. The European bonds might even be held long enough to be vindicated. Corzine worked through both days. He was in the offices for most of the weekend, making calls, reviewing numbers. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York was watching closely. Corzine called its president, Bill Dudley, 5 times in those final days. He told Congress later he was keeping the Fed informed about liquidity steps, that he thought they were going to manage through it. He believed, or said he believed, that the deal would close. Sunday night, October 30th, 11:40 in the evening. In Chicago, at the CME Group, the exchange that cleared MF Global's futures trades, auditors had been running numbers all weekend. And at 11:40 in the evening, they found what they were looking for. MF Global's own internal report showed a shortfall of $909 million in the required customer segregated accounts. $909 million that was supposed to be sitting, protected and separate, in accounts belonging to farmers and ranchers and grain cooperatives across America, was not there. The auditors called the firm. Monday, October 31st, just after 1 in the morning. MF Global's staff admitted the truth to regulators. This was not an accounting error. This was not a reconciliation delay. The money was genuinely missing. By that point, the Interactive Brokers deal was already dying. Due diligence had surfaced the discrepancies. A buyer for a brokerage firm needs to know where the money is. Nobody could tell them. Monday, October 31st, somewhere before 2 in the morning. What followed was a kind of organized disintegration. The CFO, Christine Serwinski, discovered a reserve of $220 million in an internal account and wired it into customer accounts to cover part of the deficit. Calls were made to regulators. Lawyers were contacted. The board was reached. And then a call came through to Jon Corzine. He was told that hundreds of millions of dollars in customer funds could not be located. People who were there that night describe a man who went very still. He had been pacing the hallways for hours, haggard, running on whatever energy remained after 2 days of almost no sleep. And then the call came, and he stopped. This is the moment the entire episode has been building toward. Not the bankruptcy, not the hearing. This moment. The thing destroying him is not the bet. The bet might still have been right. The thing destroying him is the structure around the bet. The borrowing, the wires, the $175 million that moved on his instructions, the $909 million hole in accounts that were supposed to be inviolable. Monday, October 31st. Morning. By dawn, the Interactive Brokers deal was dead. CME Group and NYMEX halted MF Global's ability to trade. The New York Fed stripped the firm of its primary dealer status. At mid-morning, MF Global filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. It was the 8th largest bankruptcy in United States history. The firm had $40 billion in liabilities. And somewhere inside that bankruptcy, somewhere in the tangle of wires and transfers and intraday loans and a $175 million overdraft in London, was $1.6 billion that belonged to farmers and ranchers and cooperatives across America. Nobody could find it. Jon Corzine resigned as CEO 4 days later. He declined a $12 million severance package. Whatever that gesture meant, he made it quietly, and then he largely disappeared from public life. For 6 weeks, December 13th, 2011, 6 weeks after the bankruptcy, the Senate Agriculture Committee convened an investigative hearing on the MF Global collapse. The room was full, senators on a raised dais, camera crews, staff, lawyers, and in the audience, people who had driven or flown in from Minnesota and Montana and Kansas because they wanted to look at the man who had lost their money and hear what he had to say for himself. The committee chair, Senator Debbie Stabenow, opened by saying the panel's #1 focus was to make sure the customers, the real victims, were made whole. She directed the first panel, not to Corzine, not to regulators, not to the lawyers. She directed it to the farmers and ranchers. They went first. Dean Toftland is a corn and soybean farmer from Luverne, Minnesota. He also raises hogs. He had been using the futures markets for years. Not to speculate, not to gamble, but to do the thing the futures markets were designed for. Lock in a price before the harvest. Protect the operation from the swings. Manage the risk of a business that runs on weather and seasons and forces entirely beyond any one farmer's control. He had more than $200,000 in an MF Global account when the firm collapsed. Money he had deposited as collateral, as a guarantee, a good faith deposit, the cost of participating in a market that was supposed to protect him. When he testified, he did not speak in the language of finance. He spoke in the language of someone who had been told a promise and watched it break. These funds were not an investment in MF Global, he said. These funds were not a loan to MF Global. These funds were simply collateral required by the exchange as a guarantee for my promise to deliver the bushels that I priced. He paused. Commingling money is stealing money. And then, because he was a farmer and not a lawyer, and he wanted the senators to understand exactly what had happened to him in terms they could carry home. I feel like a guy who dropped off his pickup truck at a car dealership for an oil change and returned to find it had been put up for sale because the dealership hadn't been paying its bills. The room was quiet. Senator Max Baucus spoke about a Montana grain farmer and rancher named Marty Clinker, who had lost approximately $336,000. About 60% had been recovered at the time of the hearing. The rest was somewhere in the machinery of the bankruptcy process, being argued over by lawyers, being reconciled by trustees, being treated as a legal and financial abstraction by people for whom $336,000 was a rounding error. For Marty Clinker, it was not a rounding error. For Dean Toftland, it was not a rounding error. For the 38,000 MF Global customers whose accounts were frozen on October 31st, 2011, none of it was a rounding error. Then Jon Corzine took his seat. He looked pale. He set his papers on the table in front of him, adjusted them once, and did not look up at the gallery. He was flanked by attorneys. He had prepared remarks, and he read them with the careful, measured delivery of a man who had been told to say nothing that could be used against him, while appearing to say everything. He began with an apology. I am devastated, he said, by the enormous impact the collapse of MF Global has had on customers and employees. He said he was saddened. He said he was sorry. He said he had never intended for any of this to happen. And then the questions began. Where was the money? I simply do not know where the money is, or why the accounts have not been reconciled to date. Did you authorize moving customer funds? I never intended to break segregation rules. Did you know about the transfers? I first learned of the multi-hundred-million-dollar shortfall on Sunday night. Did you give the instruction that Edith O'Brien referenced in her email? I was informed that the funds were properly transferred. Do you have a recollection of the specific transfer of $700 million out of customer accounts? I stepped in and out of calls. I don't have a recollection. The phrase, I do not know, or some variant of it appeared in his testimony so many times that it became its own kind of answer. Not an answer to the questions being asked. An answer to a different question entirely. The question of what accountability looks like when the system that is supposed to produce it reaches the edge of what it can actually compel. The law requires intent to establish criminal fraud. Intent requires proof. Proof requires evidence of what a man knew, not just what he did. And Jon Corzine, the man who had committed Goldman Sachs to $50 million more than he was authorized to commit, the man who had built a $6 billion bet on a single thesis with no one else in the room helping him think it through. The man whose initials appeared in the email authorizing the wire that started the unraveling. That man sat in the hearing room and said, with consistency, that he did not know. The Department of Justice investigated. The CFTC filed civil charges against him for failing to supervise MF Global's use of customer funds and for not acting in good faith. He eventually settled, agreeing to a lifetime ban from trading in regulated markets and paying a fine. No criminal charges were ever filed. The money came back, most of it, through years of bankruptcy proceedings, through the patient work of the trustee James Giddens, through the liquidation of assets and the unwinding of positions. MF Global's customers eventually recovered approximately 93 cents on the dollar. Dean Tofteland got most of his money back. Marty Klinker got most of his money back. But 93 cents in 2014 does not plant a field in 2012. The process took years. During those years, farmers could not access their accounts, could not adjust their hedges, could not do the thing the futures markets existed to let them do. Some had to borrow to cover the gap, paying interest on money that was legally theirs, sitting somewhere in a bankruptcy estate being processed by lawyers billing by the hour. Some had to sell at prices they had spent money to protect themselves against. For a farming operation that runs on seasonal cycles, missing a single harvest window is not an accounting problem. It is a year of your life. Jon Corzine returned to private life. In 2012, 8 months after the bankruptcy, while the trustees were still counting, he quietly opened a small hedge fund. In 2017, he closed it and returned what money remained to investors, without explanation or fanfare. He has not given a substantive interview since his congressional testimony. He has not written a memoir. He has not said anything publicly that he did not also say in that hearing room in December 2011. The farm in central Illinois, where he grew up, still exists. The farm in Luverne, Minnesota, where Dean Tofteland grows corn and soybeans and raises hogs, still exists. The futures markets still exist. The segregated account protections still exist, reinforced by new regulations passed in the wake of the collapse. The promise at the center of those markets, that the money deposited as collateral belongs to the farmer, not the broker, and will be there when the farmer needs it. That promise still exists. It nearly didn't. What do you make of Jon Corzine? Not the question of his guilt. Prosecutors looked at that for years and found the edges of it too difficult to grasp. The legal question was answered, in its way, by the fact that it was never asked in a criminal courtroom. The human question is harder. Here is a man who grew up on a farm, not unlike Dean Tofteland's, who worked harder than almost anyone around him, who built something extraordinary at Goldman Sachs, was removed from it by the people he trusted, and spent the rest of his career trying to find his way back to the level he believed he deserved to occupy. He was not stupid. He was not, in the conventional sense, reckless. He was a man with a thesis and experience and a track record that told him his instincts were worth trusting. He just trusted them with money that wasn't his. And when it was gone, when the structure he had built could no longer hold the weight of the conviction he had placed on it, he sat in a hearing room in Washington and said the only thing left to say: "I simply do not know where the money is." Maybe that was true. Maybe by that point, in the genuine chaos of those final hours, the transfers and the wires and the $175 million and the $909 million hole had become genuinely incomprehensible to the man at the center of it. Or maybe that sentence was the last trade he ever made, a bet that the truth, whatever it was, would be harder to prove than to deny. He was right about that one too.